Hi, everybody. This is Matt Kerwin from the Virginia Institute of Marine Science. I'm going to talk today about progress made on one of the second exchange consortium topics, which was related to coastal land conversion and trying to connect some remote sensing measurements to many of the local measurements that you all made as part of the first exchange consortium. And I'll start by acknowledging the collaborators and really the ones driving this project, Allison Myers-Pigg and Allie Lewis. So thank you to both of them as well. The central research question of this project is to identify the local factors that influence how marshes replace forested uplands. There are two papers that really drive this work. The first one is listed here, which is Grace Molino's work. She's a graduate student here at VIMS working with me. She identified the elevation that separates the marsh from the forest. We call it the marsh-forest boundary or the coastal tree line. She identified the elevation of the coastal tree line at 100,000 locations across the Chesapeake Bay, and then correlated that with other variables that she could identify through remote sensing, and found that tidal range, salinity, and the slope of the adjacent topography were the strongest drivers of the elevation that marshes and forests occur at. Now, there's another paper that is similar, except instead of using the threshold elevation or the elevation of the coastal tree line, a former postdoc, Yaping Chen, correlated these same variables with what we call the vertical migration rate or the vertical retreat rate, which is simply looking at how the elevation of the marsh forest boundary has changed, migrated to higher elevations through time. In both cases, tidal range, salinity, and slope were important variables, but explained only a small portion of the variation in tree line elevation. Grace Molino, for example, found that less than 50% of the variability could be explained by those relatively broad variables that can be inferred by remote sensing. And Grace attributed the rest of the variability to some combination of local factors, things like local hydrology or anthropogenic influences, or especially soil types. The soil properties in particular are really difficult to infer from remote sensing, and that's where we think that the exchange group can come in. You all collected a number of soil samples from around the bay that have been analyzed for all sorts of different soil properties that we hypothesize have a strong influence on rates of upland conversion. All right, so this slide shows vertical retreat rates for the entire Chesapeake Bay, as well as data points showing the sites that you all collected soils data for during the last exchange call. So you can see that they're pretty well distributed both throughout the Chesapeake as well as the Delaware Bay. And the basic idea is to correlate these two things, to try to build a multiple linear regression model that relates vertical retreat rate or threshold elevations to these different soil properties. The data types we'll use are a combination of what was collected during the exchange campaign, as well as the remote sensing elevations and other data sets that have already been collected. And then we may, in the future, also try to leverage new or existing high-resolution elevation surveys done in the field and vegetation types. More on that in a minute. These are the preliminary results, and this is all work that Allison Myers-Pigg has done. She has taken the threshold elevations that Grace Molino defined for the Chesapeake Bay and tried to correlate them with different soil and salinity properties collected during the first exchange call. This is just an example of one where the threshold elevation you can see is correlated positively with the adjacent surface water salinity. This is already an improvement to what the remote sensing can do. Salinity was a driver in the remote sensing methods, but the remote sensed salinity really stops inland of the major tributary rivers. It doesn't get very close, whereas many of these points were taken in the field from much smaller water bodies. And so that's led probably to an increase in the predictability of surface water salinity as a driver of threshold elevation or as a driver of vertical retreat rates. Of course, Allison did this in a multiple regression model that considers other drivers as well. So surface water salinity was the #1 driver, but several of the others were important as well, including bulk density and the moisture content of the upland soils. So we're going to continue working on this. Another step in this direction is some of the newly collected soils information, things like the water holding capacity of the soil. We'll also run these regressions for vertical retreat rates in addition to the threshold elevations. And the big next step in our framework is coming to a final decision on whether it's worth going all out on this project or cutting back with just the data we have in hand. And the big needs, if we decide to take this further, is incorporating higher resolution elevation data instead of using LiDAR data that was used in the remote sensing component of the project, to actually take RTK GPS elevations for all of the exchange site locations and pairing those with local vegetation surveys of each site. We've polled all of the members that contributed data in the first campaign to see what availability there was for elevation and vegetation type. You can see from this graph that most people didn't have the high resolution elevation data. So that would require going out to the sites and collecting it probably ourselves. And then similarly, we had similar response on the vegetation types. There were a few more people with vegetation information, but if we're going to be out there to measure elevation, might as well measure vegetation as well. I don't have a nice photos and acknowledgement slide, but I will just say thank you to both the Department of Energy collaborators, Allison and Allie, as well as to everybody involved in the exchange community, and for collecting all the great data that we're trying our best to leverage. So thank you very much.